Sarah Nelson clutched the eviction notice in her trembling hands as the morning sun cast long shadows through the dusty window of her modest home in Benton, Arkansas. Her landlord's footsteps had barely faded from her porch, but his words still echoed in her ears. "There are other ways to pay what you owe, Miss Nelson." His eyes had traveled down her body in a way that made her skin crawl, and she knew exactly what he meant. The year was 1878, and life had not been kind to Sarah since her father's passing 6 months prior. At 22, she found herself alone in a town that seemed to grow more hostile by the day. Her father's small general store had fallen into debt after his illness, and she'd been struggling to keep it afloat while paying rent on their small house at the edge of town. Sarah sank into her mother's old rocking chair, the wood creaking beneath her weight as she smoothed the crumpled paper against her skirt. 2 months behind on rent, and now Jeremiah Blackwell was demanding payment one way or another. She'd seen what happened to other women who couldn't pay their debts to men like him. They either disappeared to the brothels or became housekeepers for unmarried men, their reputations forever tarnished. "I won't give him what he wants," she whispered to herself, determination hardening in her chest even as tears threatened. Sarah had worked too hard to maintain her dignity in this town. Her father had raised her to be strong, independent, and principled values that had earned her respect from some, and resentment from others in Benton. The bell above the door of Nelson's General Store jingled cheerfully, a stark contrast to Sarah's grim mood as she arranged cans of beans on the shelf later that morning. She turned, forcing a smile that faltered when she saw who had entered. "Mr. Blackwell," she said stiffly. "I wasn't expecting you until the end of the week." Jeremiah Blackwell removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. At 50, he owned half the buildings in Benton and had a reputation for ruthlessness in business and a wandering eye for young women. "Miss Nelson," he said, his voice honey smooth but his eyes cold, "I've been thinking about your situation. Perhaps we could discuss it privately." Sarah straightened her spine. "There's nothing to discuss that can't be said here, sir." Blackwell's smile tightened. "I've been patient with you out of respect for your dear father. God rest his soul." He placed his hat on the counter between them, "But patience has its limits. I've got other folks interested in this building, people who can pay." "I'll have your money by the end of the month," Sarah said, though she had no idea how she would manage it. "That's what you said last month." Blackwell moved closer, the counter no longer between them. "A pretty young thing like you shouldn't be running a business anyway. It's not natural." Sarah stepped back, bumping against the shelves. "My father taught me everything about this store. I'm perfectly capable perhaps. Financially solvent, no." His hand reached out, fingers brushing her arm. "I could make things easy for you, Sarah. You could move into my house. I've got plenty of room and a woman's touch would be welcome." Sarah recoiled. "That's not appropriate, Mr. Blackwell. I'm your tenant, nothing more." His expression darkened. "Then as my tenant, you'll pay what you owe by Friday, or you'll find your belongings on the street." He leaned closer, his breath hot against her face. "And don't think anyone in this town will help you. I've made sure they know lending money to you would be unwise." The bell jingled again, and both turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man filling the doorway. Sarah had never been so grateful for an interruption. The stranger's eyes took in the scene before him, Sarah backed against the shelf, Blackwell standing too close. Something flashed in his blue eyes, and he stepped fully into the store. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his voice deep and calm, though his stance suggested otherwise. Blackwell straightened, turning to face the newcomer. "Just a business discussion." "Looked a bit more personal than business from where I'm standing," the stranger said, removing his hat to reveal sun-streaked brown hair. Dust covered his clothes, marking him as a traveler. "And you are?" Blackwell asked, irritation clear in his tone. "Matthew Vance," the man replied, extending no hand in greeting. "Just rode into town, looking for supplies before moving on." Sarah stepped around Blackwell, grateful for the buffer between them. "Welcome to Nelson's General Store, Mr. Vance. What can I help you with today?" Matthew's eyes remained on Blackwell for a moment longer before shifting to Sarah. Something in his expression softened. "Need coffee, ammunition, and whatever food won't spoil on the trail." "I'll leave you to your customer," Blackwell said, placing his hat back on his head. "Remember what I said, Miss Nelson. Friday." The threat hung in the air as he departed, the bell announcing his exit. Once he was gone, Sarah's shoulders slumped slightly, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking up at Matthew. He nodded, studying her face. "Men like that understand one language force. Was he threatening you?" Sarah hesitated, then busied herself collecting the items he'd requested. "Mr. Blackwell is my landlord, for both this store and my home." She didn't elaborate further, but her expression said enough. Matthew leaned against the counter, watching her. "How much does he say you owe?" Sarah glanced up, surprised by the direct question. "That's hardly your concern, Mr. Vance." A slight smile touched his lips. "Fair enough. But I know trouble when I see it, and that man is trouble with a capital T." Sarah measured coffee beans into a paper sack, weighing her next words carefully. "It's a small town, Mr. Vance. Some men have power and others. Well, others have to find ways to work around that power. Or find someone who isn't afraid of it," Matthew replied, his tone casual but his meaning clear. Sarah tied the coffee sack with string, avoiding his gaze. "Are you passing through Benton, or do you have business here?" "Was just passing through," he said, paying for his supplies. "Now I'm not so sure." The next morning, Sarah was arranging fresh produce when the bell rang. Matthew Vance stood in the doorway, looking more presentable than the day before. He'd clearly bathed and changed his clothes. "Mr. Vance," she said, surprised. "I thought you'd be miles away by now." "Decided Benton might be worth a longer look," he replied, approaching the counter. "How long have you been running this store alone?" Sarah wrapped a customer's purchase in brown paper. "Since my father died 6 months ago. Before that, I helped him for years." Matthew nodded, looking around the well-organized space. "You do a good job. Place is clean, well-stocked." "Thank you," Sarah said, wondering why he'd really returned. Men didn't usually notice such things, and compliments from strangers were rare in her experience. As if reading her thoughts, Matthew leaned on the counter. "I heard some talk at the saloon last night, about you and Blackwell." Sarah's cheeks flushed. "People in this town have little to occupy themselves besides gossip." "Gossip often holds truth," Matthew said. "They say he's been pressuring women who owe him money, women without husbands or fathers to protect them." Sarah's hand stilled on the paper. "And what business is that of yours, Mr. Vance?" His blue eyes held hers steadily. "I don't like bullies, Miss Nelson. Never have." Before she could respond, the door opened again, and Jeremiah Blackwell entered with 2 of his associates, men who worked as collectors for his various businesses. Sarah's stomach tightened. "Miss Nelson," Blackwell said, his tone falsely pleasant. "I hope you're prepared to settle our account today." Matthew didn't move from his position at the counter, but his posture changed subtly, a coiled readiness in his stance. "Mr. Blackwell," Sarah began, "I thought we agreed on Friday." "Plans change," Blackwell replied, eyes flicking to Matthew then back to her. "I've decided I need that payment today, all of it." Sarah's heart sank. "You know that's impossible. I don't have." "Then we'll discuss alternative arrangements." Blackwell stepped closer, his 2 men flanking him. Unless your new friend here plans to pay your debts. Matthew straightened to his full height, which put him several inches taller than Blackwell. How much does she owe you? Blackwell named a sum that made Sarah gasp nearly twice what she actually owed him. That's not the correct amount, she protested. You've added interest that wasn't in our agreement. Interest accrues, Miss Nelson. Your father would have understood business. Matthew's voice cut through the tension. Show me the contract. Blackwell's smile faltered. That's private business. If you're claiming money is owed, there should be paperwork, Matthew pressed. Unless you're making up figures as you go along. The two men with Blackwell shifted their stance, hands moving closer to their weapons. Matthew didn't miss the movement, but he remained calm, his eyes steady on Blackwell. I don't know who you think you are, Blackwell snarled, but this doesn't concern you. I'm making it my concern, Matthew replied. Miss Nelson here deserves fair treatment, and it seems to me you're not offering that. Blackwell's face reddened. You're new in town, so let me explain something. I own half of Benton. The sheriff enjoys my hospitality regularly. The mayor and I play cards every Thursday night. So unless you plan on moving in permanently, I suggest you back away from matters that don't concern drifters. Matthew didn't flinch. I've met men like you in every territory from here to California. You might own buildings, but you don't own people. The store fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Blackwell laughed, though no humor reached his eyes. Friday, Miss Nelson. All of it, or you're out of both properties. He turned to leave, then looked back at Matthew. Enjoy your brief stay in Benton, Mr. Vance. I hear the weather's turning bad. Might be dangerous for traveling soon. After they departed, Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You shouldn't have done that, she said, though gratitude filled her voice. He doesn't make idle threats. Neither do I, Matthew replied, his expression grim. How much do you actually owe him? Sarah hesitated, then named a sum that was still substantial but far less than Blackwell's claim, and he's trying to force you to. Matthew didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. He suggested I could work off my debt by becoming his housekeeper, Sarah said, the words bitter on her tongue. But we both know what that means. Matthew nodded slowly. Do you have anywhere else you could go? Family. My mother died years ago. My father was my only family. Sarah straightened the items on her counter, needing to keep her hands busy. I've built my life here. This store was my father's dream. I can't just abandon it. Sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do, Matthew said softly. Especially when staying means losing more than just property. Sarah looked up at him, really studying his face for the first time. He was handsome in a rugged way, with laugh lines around his eyes despite his serious expression. Something about him suggested he knew what it meant to leave things behind. Why are you helping me? She asked finally. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. I've seen what men like Blackwell do to towns, how they crush the spirit out of good people. Sometimes all it takes is one person standing up to them to change things. Or one person getting crushed as an example to others, Sarah countered. A hint of a smile touched Matthew's lips. Then it's a good thing you're not alone anymore. The following day, Matthew returned to the store with a proposition that left Sarah speechless. You want to buy my father's store, she repeated, stunned by his offer. Not exactly, Matthew clarified, leaning against the counter. I want to invest in it, become a partner. That would give you enough to pay off Blackwell and keep operating. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. You don't even know me, Mr. Vance. Why would you invest your money in my business? I've been watching. You know what you're doing here. You're fair with customers, keep good inventory, and this town needs an honest shopkeeper. He paused. And it's Matthew, please. It's still a risk, Sarah insisted. The store hasn't been profitable since before my father's illness. Life is risk, Matthew replied simply. I've done well for myself over the years. Invested in cattle, did some mining. I'm not as footloose as I appear. Sarah studied him, trying to determine if there was some hidden motive behind his generosity. And what would you expect in return for this investment? A fair percentage of the profits once the store is back on solid footing. And maybe, he hesitated, a chance to prove not all men are like Blackwell. Before Sarah could respond, the door burst open and Blackwell's two associates entered, looking more menacing than before. Miss Nelson, the taller one said, Mr. Blackwell sent us to collect some collateral against your debt. What? Sarah stepped forward. That wasn't part of our arrangement. The shorter man shrugged. New terms. We're taking inventory as security. Matthew moved to stand beside Sarah. I don't think you are. The men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting resistance. This ain't your business, stranger. Actually, it is, Matthew replied coolly. I'm Miss Nelson's new business partner. Any debt she owes is now partially my responsibility, and I'm telling you nothing leaves this store today. The taller man's hand moved to his gun. Mr. Blackwell isn't going to like that. Mr. Blackwell can discuss it with me directly, Matthew said, his stance casual but alert. I'll be visiting him this afternoon to settle accounts. The men looked uncertain, clearly not prepared for this development. After a tense moment, they backed toward the door. This isn't over, the shorter one warned before they departed. When they were gone, Sarah turned to Matthew, a mix of gratitude and worry on her face. You shouldn't have done that. Now you've made yourself a target too. Better me than you, Matthew replied, his expression softening. I meant what I said about being your partner, Sarah, if you'll accept. Sarah's mind raced, weighing her limited options. Matthew Vance was still largely a stranger, yet something in her trusted him more than anyone she'd met since her father died. Why? She asked again. The truth this time. Matthew was quiet for a moment. My sister was in a similar situation once. A powerful man, debts she couldn't pay. I wasn't there to help her. His jaw tightened. I swore I'd never stand by again if I could prevent someone else from suffering the same fate. The raw honesty in his voice convinced Sarah more than any business argument could have. What happened to your sister? She found her own way out eventually, Matthew said, though his tone suggested the story wasn't a happy one. But it cost her dearly. Sarah nodded slowly. If we do this, if I accept your help, I want everything in writing. A proper partnership agreement. Matthew's face brightened with a genuine smile. I'd expect nothing less from a good businesswoman. That afternoon, they visited the town lawyer, a nervous man named Ellis, who clearly had reservations about drawing up papers that would challenge Blackwell's interests. Nevertheless, money spoke louder than fear, and by evening, Sarah and Matthew had a legal partnership agreement and enough cash to settle her debt with Blackwell. I'll accompany you to his office tomorrow, Matthew said as they left the lawyer's building. Make sure everything's handled properly. Sarah looked up at him, the setting sun painting the street in golden hues. You know this won't end with paying the debt. Blackwell isn't used to being thwarted. I'm counting on it, Matthew replied, his expression determined. When they arrived at Blackwell's office the next morning, they found the landlord seated behind an imposing desk, clearly surprised by their joint appearance. Miss Nelson, he said, ignoring Matthew completely. I don't recall inviting your friend to our meeting. Mr. Vance is my business partner now, Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. We're here to settle my debt in full. Blackwell's eyebrows rose. Partner, how convenient, and temporary, I imagine. Matthew stepped forward, placing a bank draft on the desk. This covers everything Miss Nelson legitimately owes you. with interest as specified in the original agreement her father signed. Blackwell didn't touch the paper. The amount has increased since our last conversation. No, it hasn't, Matthew said flatly. The lawyer has reviewed the contract. This is the correct amount. Blackwell's face hardened. Ellis shouldn't be poking his nose where it doesn't belong. The law applies to everyone, Mr. Blackwell, Sarah said, finding courage in Matthew's steady presence beside her. Even you. Blackwell slowly picked up the bank draft, examining it. This settles your store debt. There's still the matter of your house. Sarah felt her heart sink, but Matthew remained impassive. The agreement covered both properties. The rental amounts were clearly specified. Circumstances change, Blackwell insisted, leaning back in his chair. Housing is at a premium in Benton these days. I'm afraid Miss Nelson's monthly rent will be doubling, effective immediately. Sarah gasped. That's impossible. You can't just, I can and I am, Blackwell interrupted. Unless, of course, you'd like to reconsider my previous offer. Matthew's voice was dangerously quiet when he spoke. The offer where you trade housing for exploitation. That offer, Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. I was offering employment. What happens between employer and employee is private business. We both know what you were offering, Matthew said. And it stops now. Blackwell stood, placing his hands flat on the desk. You're in my town, Vance. Don't think for a moment that your money will protect you or her. Matthew didn't back down. Are you accepting the payment or not? After a tense moment, Blackwell took the bank draft and wrote out a receipt, paid in full, for the store debt. As for the house, he looked at Sarah. You have until the end of the week to pay the new rate or vacate. Outside, Sarah tried to maintain her composure, but her hands were shaking. He's going to force me out of my home now. Matthew guided her toward the store, his hand gentle on her elbow. Let him try. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The thought of losing her childhood home, the place where her parents had raised her, where her father had spent his final days, was almost too much to bear. She sat in the kitchen, a cold cup of tea before her, when a soft knock at her door startled her. Cautiously approaching the door, she called out, "Who's there?" "It's Matthew," came the reply. Sarah opened the door to find him standing on her porch, hat in hand. "It's past midnight," she said, though she stepped back to let him in. "I've been thinking," he said, entering but remaining near the door. "Blackwell won't stop. Even if you could pay the increased rent, he'd find another way to pressure you." Sarah sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "I know. As long as I'm alone, he sees me as vulnerable." Matthew nodded grimly. "There's only one solution I can see. You need to leave Benton." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Leave? But this is my home. My whole life is here." "Your life is wherever you make it," Matthew said gently. "Staying here under Blackwell's thumb isn't living, it's surviving, and barely that." Sarah stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. "Where would I go? How would I support myself?" Matthew took a seat across from her. "I own land about 50 miles west of here. Good land with a decent house. There's a small town nearby growing every year. They need a general store." Sarah blinked in surprise. "You're offering me your land?" "I'm offering you a fresh start," Matthew clarified. "A place where Blackwell has no power. The land has been sitting empty while I've been traveling. It would be good to see it put to use." "I can't just take your property," Sarah protested. "You wouldn't be taking it, we'd be extending our partnership." Matthew leaned forward, his expression earnest. "We could move your inventory, start fresh, build something good." Sarah stared into her tea, mind racing. The thought of leaving Benton was terrifying, but staying seemed increasingly dangerous. "What about my father's store? This house? I can't just abandon them." "You'd be surprised what you can walk away from when necessary," Matthew said softly. Buildings are just buildings, Sarah. Your father's legacy is in how he raised you, not in these walls. A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek. When would we have to leave? Soon, Matthew said. Blackwell will escalate once he realizes you're not giving in. I've arranged for a wagon and some help. We could be packed and gone by tomorrow night. Tomorrow, Sarah gasped. That's so soon. The longer we wait, the more time Blackwell has to cause problems, Matthew explained. He has the sheriff in his pocket, remember? All it would take is one trumped-up charge to make things much worse. Sarah knew he was right. She'd seen how Blackwell operated, how he'd ruined others who stood against him. Still, the thought of leaving so abruptly made her heart ache. I need to think, she said finally. Matthew nodded, rising to his feet. I'll come by the store in the morning. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. After he left, Sarah moved through her small house, touching familiar objects, remembering. Her mother's rocking chair, the quilt her grandmother had made, her father's favorite books. Each item held memories, but Matthew was right, they were just things. Her parents would want her safe, not clinging to possessions at the cost of her freedom or dignity. By morning, her decision was made. When Matthew arrived at the store, Sarah was already packing the most valuable inventory into crates. "You're coming," he said, relief evident in his voice. Sarah nodded, determination replacing her earlier uncertainty. "Yes, but I want to be clear about something, Matthew. I'm accepting your help, but I won't be beholden to you or any man. This is a business arrangement." Matthew's expression was solemn. "Absolutely. Partners, nothing more." "Then let's hurry," Sarah said. Blackwell usually makes his rounds mid-afternoon. They worked quickly, enlisting the help of a few loyal customers who were also tired of Blackwell's grip on the town. By midday, the most valuable inventory was packed, and Matthew had arranged for a large wagon to transport everything. Sarah had returned to her house to pack her personal belongings. She was wrapping her mother's china when a loud banging on her front door made her jump. Before she could answer, the door burst open and Blackwell strode in, flanked by the sheriff. "What's this I hear about you packing up my store?" he demanded, his face flushed with anger. Sarah straightened, forcing herself to remain calm. "It's not your store anymore. The debt is paid." "You're breaking our agreement," Blackwell insisted. "The terms clearly state that the business must remain operational at that location." "There's nothing in the agreement that says that," Sarah countered, grateful that she and Matthew had studied the contract carefully. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Graves, stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwell says you've been selling store property that's held as collateral. That's theft, Miss Nelson." "There is no collateral," Sarah replied. "The debt is paid in full. You can verify that with Mr. Blackwell's own receipt." Blackwell's face darkened further. "The receipt covers the building, not the contents. I'm placing you under arrest, Miss Nelson, until we sort this matter out." As the sheriff moved toward her, the back door opened, and Matthew entered, his expression turning thunderous at the scene before him. "Step away from her," he said, his voice deadly quiet. Sheriff Graves turned, his hand moving to his gun. "This doesn't concern you, Vance." "I beg to differ," Matthew replied. "You're attempting to arrest my business partner under false pretenses." Blackwell sneered. "Your partnership doesn't change the law." "No, but this might," Matthew said, producing a document from his coat. "A letter from Judge Peterson in Little Rock, acknowledging our complaint about corruption in Benton and the harassment of Miss Nelson. He's particularly interested in how certain property owners might be abusing their influence with local law enforcement." Sheriff Graves hesitated, looking uncertainly at Blackwell. "Judge Peterson. He'll be sending a federal marshal to investigate," Matthew continued. "Should be here within the week." Blackwell's face paled slightly, but he recovered quickly. "You're bluffing." Am I? Matthew held out the letter. See for yourself. The judge's seal is right there. The sheriff took the letter, reading it with growing concern. Jeremiah, if the federal court gets involved. It's a forgery, Blackwell snapped, though doubt had crept into his voice. Take that chance if you want, Matthew said, but ask yourself if it's worth risking everything you've built here over one woman who's already paid her debts. A tense silence filled the room as Blackwell weighed his options. Finally, he snatched the letter from the sheriff's hands and tore it in half. This changes nothing, he growled. You'll regret crossing me, both of you. We're leaving Benton, Matthew said calmly. Tonight. Miss Nelson has paid everything she owes you. There's no law against her taking her own property and departing. Blackwell's eyes narrowed. Running away, are you? That just proves your guilt. It proves we're smart enough not to stay where the game is rigged, Sarah said, finding her voice. You can have the building, Mr. Blackwell. I'm taking my life back. Sheriff Graves shifted uncomfortably. If she's paid her debts and is leaving voluntarily, there's not much I can do, Jeremiah. Blackwell glared at them all, his plans unraveling before his eyes. This isn't over, he promised, pointing at Matthew. Men like you don't put down roots. You'll leave her eventually, and when you do, I'll be waiting. You'll be waiting a long time, Matthew replied steadily. Now get out of Miss Nelson's house before I forget my manners entirely. After a final venomous look, Blackwell stormed out, the sheriff following reluctantly behind him. Once they were gone, Sarah's knees gave way, and she sank into a chair. Do you really have a letter from a judge? Matthew's serious expression broke into a slight smile. I do, though it's not quite as specific as I implied. Judge Peterson is an old friend. He's been looking for a reason to investigate Blackwell for years. Sarah shook her head in amazement. That was incredibly risky. Less risky than letting him arrest you, Matthew countered. Now we need to move fast. Blackwell won't stay intimidated for long. They worked through the afternoon, loading Sarah's personal belongings onto the wagon already filled with store inventory. As the sun began to set, Sarah took one final walk through her childhood home, saying goodbye to the place that had sheltered her for 22 years. On the porch, she paused, looking back at the simple wooden structure that held so many memories. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down, turning to where Matthew waited with the wagon. Ready? He asked gently. Sarah nodded, squaring her shoulders. Ready. As they climbed onto the wagon seat, movement down the street caught Sarah's eye. Blackwell stood watching, several of his men gathered around him. Their postures suggested they weren't just there to bid farewell. Matthew, Sarah whispered, nodding toward the group. I see them, he replied, his voice calm despite the tension in his jaw. Don't worry. We've got a head start, and I know these roads better than they do. As they pulled away from the house, Blackwell shouted something that was lost in the sound of the wagon wheels. Sarah didn't look back again, her gaze fixed firmly ahead as they left Benton behind. Night had fallen by the time they reached the edge of town. Matthew guided the wagon onto the western trail, the horses moving at a steady pace that would eat up miles without exhausting them. How far can we get tonight? Sarah asked, pulling her shawl tighter against the evening chill. There's a way station about 15 miles ahead, Matthew replied. Run by a friend of mine. We'll stop there, get some rest before continuing tomorrow. Sarah nodded, watching the road ahead disappear into darkness. Do you think they'll follow us? Matthew's expression was grim in the fading light. Blackwell's pride is wounded. Men like that don't let go easily. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon and the horses' steady hoofbeats the only sounds. Sarah found herself studying Matthew's profile, wondering about the man who had so suddenly become her protector and partner. "You never told me what brought you to Benton in the first place," she said finally. Matthew adjusted the reins in his hands. "I was heading to my property to check on things. Benton was on the way." "Lucky coincidence for me," Sarah murmured. "I don't believe much in coincidence," Matthew replied. "My pa used to say we're put in certain places at certain times for a reason." "And what reason brought you to my store just when Blackwell was threatening me?" Sarah asked. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe to remind me that there are still things worth fighting for in this world." The simple honesty in his words touched Sarah deeply. Before she could respond, a sound behind them drew their attention. Matthew glanced over his shoulder, his expression hardening. "Riders," he said tersely. "Moving fast." Sarah turned to look, her heart sinking at the sight of several mounted men silhouetted against the night sky, torches flickering in their hands. "Blackwell's men?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Most likely," Matthew replied, urging the horses to a faster pace. "Hold on tight." The wagon lurched forward, its heavy load making it difficult to outrun their pursuers. Sarah gripped the seat as they bounced over the rutted trail, the gap between them and the riders steadily narrowing. "They're gaining on us," she said, fear creeping into her voice. Matthew's expression was determined as he guided the horses around a sharp bend. "The way station is just ahead. If we can reach it, we'll have help." A gunshot cracked through the night air, the bullet whistling past them to thud into a tree trunk. Sarah ducked instinctively. "They're shooting at us," she cried. "Warning shots," Matthew said grimly. "They want us to stop." He reached beneath the seat, pulling out a rifle and handing it to Sarah. "Can you use this?" Sarah took the weapon, surprised by its weight. "My father taught me, but I've never shot at a person." "Let's hope you don't have to," Matthew replied. "Just having it visible might make them think twice." Another shot rang out, closer this time. Sarah turned, raising the rifle to her shoulder. She didn't aim directly at the riders but fired into the air above them. The report was deafening, but she saw the lead rider pull up short, clearly not expecting resistance. "Good," Matthew said approvingly. "That'll slow them down." The lights of the way station appeared ahead, a welcome sight in the darkness. As they approached, Matthew called out loudly, "Tom." "We've got trouble." The door of the station burst open and a burly man appeared with a shotgun. Two more men emerged from the stable, similarly armed. "Matt," the first man called. "That you?" "It's me, Tom," Matthew confirmed as he brought the wagon to a halt in front of the building. "We've got riders on our tail, Blackwell's men from Benton." Tom spat on the ground. "Blackwell, eh? Been waiting for someone to stand up to that snake." He signaled to his companions. "Jackson, Peters, get ready." Their pursuers had slowed, clearly reassessing the situation now that their quarry had reached safety and reinforcements. After a tense standoff, they wheeled their horses around and disappeared back the way they had come. "They'll be back," Tom said, lowering his shotgun. "Blackwell doesn't give up easy." "Neither do we," Matthew replied, helping Sarah down from the wagon. "Sarah, this is Tom Henderson. Owned this way station for 15 years and the best shot in 3 counties. Tom removed his hat in greeting. "Miss Nelson." "Matt's letter mentioned you might be coming this way. Didn't expect you'd have a welcoming party chasing you, though." "Letter?" Sarah looked at Matthew in surprise. Matthew had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I sent word ahead after our first conversation. Wanted to make sure we'd have help if needed." "You were that confident I'd agree to leave?" Sarah asked, unsure whether to be offended or impressed by his foresight. "I was hopeful," Matthew corrected, "and cautious." Tom chuckled. "Matt's always been 3 steps ahead of trouble." "Come inside, both of you. My wife's got stew on and you look like you could use a hot meal and rest." Inside the way station, A cozy fire burned in the hearth, and the smell of beef stew filled the air. Tom's wife, Martha, a kind-faced woman with gray-streaked hair, welcomed them warmly. "You poor dear," she said to Sarah. "Running from that awful Blackwell, we've heard stories even out here." Sarah accepted a bowl of stew gratefully. "Thank you for taking us in. It's been quite a day." "You're safe here for the night," Tom assured them, taking his own seat at the table. "But you'll want to be moving on at first light. Blackwell's influence doesn't reach much beyond the county line, but he's got friends who might help him." Matthew nodded grimly. "We'll head out at dawn. It's another day's journey to my place." As they ate, Tom and Matthew discussed routes and potential trouble spots, while Martha fussed over Sarah, insisting she take seconds and providing fresh bread to accompany the stew. The normalcy of the scene, a shared meal, friendly conversation, helped calm Sarah's frayed nerves. After dinner, Martha showed Sarah to a small but clean room. "It's not much," she apologized, "but you'll be comfortable enough." "It's perfect," Sarah assured her. "Thank you for everything." Left alone, Sarah sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her. She had left behind everything familiar, fleeing in the night like a criminal. Yet mixed with her fear and uncertainty was a surprising sense of liberation. For the first time in months, she wasn't living under Blackwell's shadow. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Opening it, she found Matthew standing there, his expression concerned. "Just wanted to make sure you're all right," he said. "It's been a difficult day." Sarah managed a tired smile. "I'm surprisingly fine, frightened, but also relieved in a way. Does that make sense?" Matthew nodded. "Perfect sense. Sometimes running is the bravest thing you can do." He hesitated, then added, "I want you to know that I meant what I said earlier. You're safe now, Sarah. I won't let anything happen to you." The simple promise, spoken so earnestly, brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. "Thank you, Matthew, not just for the protection, but for giving me a choice, for making me feel like I'm not alone." Something flickered in Matthew's blue eyes, a warmth that made Sarah's heart beat a little faster. "Get some rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow's a new beginning." After he left, Sarah lay on the bed, too tired to undress fully but too wired to sleep immediately. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of male voices as Matthew and Tom continued their conversation. The words weren't clear, but the tone was serious. They were planning, preparing for potential trouble tomorrow. Despite the uncertainty ahead, Sarah felt a strange peace settle over her. Whatever happened, she wasn't facing it alone anymore. Dawn arrived too quickly, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the small window. Sarah dressed hastily, gathering her few possessions. Outside, she found Matthew already loading the wagon while Martha prepared a breakfast of eggs and bacon. "Eat quickly," Tom advised, checking his rifle. "I've got a man watching the road. No sign of Blackwell's gang yet, but they'll be coming." Sarah ate quickly, though her stomach was too knotted with tension to enjoy the food. Matthew seemed calm, discussing their route with Tom one final time. "Stay on the main trail until you reach Copper Creek," Tom was saying. "Then take the North Fork. It's rougher going but less traveled. Anyone following will likely stick to the main road." Matthew nodded, committing the directions to memory. "We'll make good time if we push the horses." As they prepared to depart, Martha pressed a bundle into Sarah's hands. "Food for the journey," she explained. "And a little something to remember us by." Inside the package, Sarah found a small hand-carved wooden box. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely touched. Martha patted her hand. "Every woman needs a place to keep her treasures. You'll make new memories to fill it." The wagon was loaded and ready, the horses stamping impatiently in the early morning chill. Tom's lookout came running from his post at the edge of the property. "Riders coming," he reported tersely. At least 6 of them, moving fast. Tom's expression hardened. "You two get going. We'll slow them down." Matthew clasped Tom's hand firmly. "I owe you." "Just doing what's right," Tom replied. "Now go." They climbed onto the wagon and Matthew snapped the reins. The horses lurched forward, quickly gaining speed as they headed west. Behind them, Sarah could hear Tom and his men preparing their defense. The wagon rattled along the trail, each bump and jolt reminding Sarah of the precariousness of their situation. Matthew kept the horses at a steady pace, fast enough to cover ground quickly but not so fast they'd be exhausted too soon. "What if they hurt Tom and Martha because of us?" Sarah asked, guilt creeping into her voice. "Tom can handle himself," Matthew assured her. "And Blackwell's men aren't killers, not normally. They're bullies who prefer easier targets." They rode in tense silence for several miles, both listening for sounds of pursuit. When they reached Copper Creek, a small, swift-running stream cutting across the trail, Matthew guided the horses through the shallow water and onto the northern fork as Tom had advised. The trail immediately became rougher, winding through dense forest that provided good cover but made for slower travel. By midday, they had seen no sign of pursuers, and Sarah began to hope they might have escaped. "You think we lost them?" she asked as Matthew stopped briefly to rest the horses. "Maybe," he replied, though his expression remained vigilant as he scanned their back trail. "Or they're being more careful, knowing we're armed." Sarah stepped down from the wagon, stretching her legs. The forest around them was peaceful, birds singing in the branches overhead. It was hard to believe they were being hunted. "How much further to your land?" she asked. "About 20 miles, Matthew said. "If we keep moving, we'll be there by nightfall." Sarah nodded, drawing comfort from the concrete goal ahead. "What's it like, your place?" Matthew's expression softened. "It's good land. A small house, nothing fancy but solid, about 100 acres with water from a spring that never runs dry. The nearest town is Willow Creek, maybe 5 miles away, small but growing. And no Blackwell," Sarah added with a wry smile. "No Blackwell," Matthew confirmed, "though every town has its challenges." They continued their journey, the trail gradually descending from the forested hills into more open country. By late afternoon, they emerged onto a broad valley, golden with autumn grasses. In the distance, Sarah could see scattered homesteads, smoke rising from chimneys against the backdrop of mountains to the west. "Almost there," Matthew said, pointing to a cluster of buildings in the far distance. "That's Willow Creek. My place is this side of town, just beyond that stand of trees." Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. This valley, so different from the familiar landscapes around Benton, would be her new home. Everything here was unknown: the land, the people, the future. As if sensing her thoughts, Matthew added, "The folks here are good people. Hardworking, honest. They'll welcome you once they get to know you. And us arriving together, fleeing from another town. What will they think of that?" Sarah asked, suddenly concerned about her reputation. Matthew considered this. "They'll talk at first, people always do. But actions speak louder than words. Once they see you're a respectable businesswoman, the talk will die down." They followed the trail past the turn to Willow Creek, continuing on toward Matthew's property. As the sun began to set, they crested a small rise, and Matthew pulled the wagon to a halt. "There it is," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Home." Sarah gazed at the scene below them. A modest cabin sat nestled against a grove of trees, a small barn and corral nearby. A creek wound through the property, reflecting the golden light of sunset. Though simple, the place had a welcoming feel that tugged at Sarah's heart. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. Matthew's smile was warm as he flicked the reins, guiding the wagon down the slope toward the cabin. "It needs a woman's touch. Been too long since anyone's really lived here." As they approached, Sarah could see that while the buildings were solid, they showed signs of neglect: weathered wood that needed paint, a sagging porch step, weeds growing around the foundations. "How long have you been away?" she asked. "Almost 2 years," Matthew admitted. "After my wife died, I couldn't stay. Too many memories." Sarah turned to him in surprise. "You were married," Matthew nodded, his expression somber, "for 3 years. Catherine took fever 4 winters ago, nothing the doctor could do." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly, understanding now some of the sadness she'd occasionally glimpsed in his eyes. "You never mentioned." "It's not something I talk about much," Matthew replied, "but you should know coming here." They pulled up in front of the cabin, and Matthew helped Sarah down from the wagon. The air was cool and fresh, scented with pine from the nearby woods. After the long journey, the solid ground beneath Sarah's feet felt reassuringly stable. Matthew pushed open the cabin door, which creaked on its hinges. "It'll need some cleaning," he said apologetically. "Been a while since I was here last." Sarah stepped inside, taking in the simple interior. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a wooden table and chairs stood in the center, and a few pieces of sturdy furniture completed the main room. Doorways led to what she assumed were bedrooms. Despite the dust and disuse, she could see the care that had gone into building the place. "I'll take the barn tonight," Matthew said, setting her bag inside the door. "Give you time to settle in." "The barn," Sarah protested, "but this is your home." Matthew shook his head. "You need your privacy. We'll figure out more permanent arrangements tomorrow. For now, let's get the horses taken care of and bring in enough of your things for tonight." As darkness fell, they worked together to unload essential items from the wagon and care for the tired horses. Matthew built a fire in the hearth, and Sarah used some of Martha's provisions to prepare a simple meal. The domestic activity felt strangely normal after the tension of their journey. Sitting across the table from Matthew, eating by lamplight in his cabin, Sarah was struck by how quickly her life had changed. Just 2 days ago, she had been in Benton, dreading Blackwell's next visit. Now she was miles away, beginning a new chapter with a man she barely knew yet somehow trusted completely. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Sarah smiled slightly. "That life can change in an instant, for better or worse." "And which is this?" he asked, his eyes studying her face. "Better or worse? I'm not sure yet," Sarah admitted honestly, "but I'm grateful to be here rather than facing Blackwell alone." Matthew nodded, understanding in his gaze. "It won't be easy starting over, but you're not alone anymore, Sarah. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The simple promise warmed Sarah more than the fire in the hearth. As Matthew left for the barn, promising to check on her before dawn, she realized that despite everything she had left behind, she had gained something perhaps more valuable: a true ally in a world that had often seemed set against her. The next morning, Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her sleep-addled mind. Then memory returned: Blackwell, the flight from Benton, Matthew's land. Her new home, at least for now. Rising quickly, she dressed and stepped outside to find Matthew already at work, repairing the broken porch step. He looked up at her approach, hammer in hand, his smile warm in the morning light. "Sleep well?" he asked, setting aside his tools. "Better than I expected," Sarah admitted. "Though I had strange dreams." "Not surprising after everything that's happened," Matthew replied. "Thought I'd get started on some repairs. Place needs work." Sarah looked around, seeing the property in full daylight for the first time. Though neglected, the bones of a good homestead were clear, fertile land, abundant water, solid structures. With work, it could be truly beautiful. "I want to help," she said. "This is my home now, too, at least for the time being." Matthew's expression softened. "It can be your home for as long as you want, Sarah. I meant what I said about the partnership." Over breakfast, they discussed plans. The most pressing need was to finish unloading the wagon and find secure storage for Sarah's store inventory. "The old root cellar would work for now," Matthew suggested. "It's dry and can be locked. Eventually, we could look at building a proper store in town." "You think Willow Creek could support another general store?" Sarah asked. Matthew nodded. "The town's growing." "The current store is run by Old Man Jenkins, who's talking about retiring. Folks have to travel 20 miles to the next town for anything he doesn't carry." As they worked through the morning, unloading crates and cleaning the root cellar, Sarah found herself watching Matthew. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to physical labor, his strong hands gentle when helping her with heavy items. Despite their brief acquaintance, there was a comfortable rhythm to their interaction, as if they'd known each other much longer. By midday, the wagon was empty, and the root cellar organized with Sarah's inventory neatly arranged and cataloged. They paused for a light meal, sitting on the newly repaired porch steps. "I should ride into town this afternoon," Matthew said. "Let folks know I'm back and explain about you." Sarah tensed slightly. "What will you tell them?" Matthew considered his words carefully. "The truth, mostly. That you're my business partner, that we left Benton because of troubles with Blackwell. People here know his reputation, it won't surprise them. And us living here together." Sarah pressed. "What will they think of that?" "They'll talk," Matthew admitted frankly. "But I've built up some goodwill in these parts. People respect me, and once they meet you, they'll understand why I'm helping you." Sarah wasn't entirely convinced, but she nodded. "I'd like to come with you." Better to face any gossip directly than hide away and let imaginations run wild. Matthew smiled approvingly. "Brave and sensible. Ride with me then. Time you met your new neighbors." They set out an hour later, riding side by side on Matthew's horses. Sarah wore her best remaining dress, though it was somewhat wrinkled from being packed. As they approached Willow Creek, she straightened her shoulders, determined to make a good first impression despite her unconventional arrival. The town was smaller than Benton but neat and prosperous looking. A main street lined with businesses, a church at one end and scattered houses spreading outward. People stopped to stare as they rode in, clearly curious about Matthew's companion. "Matt Vance," a voice called out as they reached the general store. A stout, gray-haired man emerged, wiping his hands on his apron. "Thought you'd abandoned us for good." "Just wandering, Jenkins," Matthew replied with a smile, dismounting and helping Sarah down. "This is Miss Sarah Nelson, my new business partner." Old Man Jenkins studied Sarah with undisguised curiosity. "Partner, eh? In what business would that be?" "Miss Nelson ran her father's general store in Benton," Matthew explained. "She's got experience that might interest you, considering your talk of retiring." Understanding dawned on Jenkins's face. "Ah, come in, come in. The wife just made coffee." Inside the store, Sarah was introduced to Mrs. Jenkins, a pleasant woman who immediately offered refreshments and began asking questions about Sarah's experience running a store. The conversation flowed easily, with Sarah growing more comfortable as she spoke about familiar topics. "Benton's loss is our gain," Jenkins declared after hearing part of their story. "Blackwell's a known scoundrel. Not surprised you had to leave in a hurry." "We're hoping to open a store here eventually," Matthew said, watching Sarah's animated discussion with Mrs. Jenkins about inventory management. "Once we're settled." Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. Been thinking of selling this place. These old bones aren't what they used to be. Might be we could come to an arrangement. By the time they left the store, word of their arrival had spread, and several townsfolk found reasons to pass by and introduce themselves. Some were openly curious, others more reserved, but none showed outright hostility. Their next stop was the small bank, where Matthew introduced Sarah to the manager, a serious young man named Harris. Matthew withdrew funds to cover immediate expenses and updated his accounts to include Sarah as a business partner with access to certain funds, a gesture of trust that took her by surprise. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly as they left the bank. "We're partners," Matthew replied simply. "And I trust you." Their final visit was to the home of Reverend Thomas, the town's minister and, Sarah quickly realized, a close friend of Matthew's. The elderly clergyman welcomed them warmly, his wife fussing over them with tea and cake while he and Matthew caught up. "And now you must tell me about your young lady," Reverend Thomas said, turning kind eyes to Sarah. "Miss Nelson is my business partner," Matthew began, but the Reverend waved away the explanation. Yes, I've heard the official version from 3 people already. Now tell me the truth of it." Matthew glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly, giving permission to share their story more fully. He explained about Blackwell's harassment, Sarah's courage in standing up to him, and their hasty departure from Benton. "Disgraceful," Mrs. Thomas muttered. "Using his position to prey on a young woman. You did right to help her, Matthew." "The arrangement is temporary," Sarah added, "until I can establish myself independently." Reverend Thomas studied her thoughtfully. "Life rarely follows our careful plans, my dear. Sometimes the temporary becomes permanent in ways we never expected." His gaze shifted between her and Matthew, a knowing smile touching his lips. As they prepared to leave, the Reverend took Matthew aside for a private word, while Mrs. Thomas pressed a jar of preserves into Sarah's hands. "People may talk," the older woman said kindly, "but those worth knowing will judge you by your actions, not rumors. You're welcome at our table anytime." Riding back to the cabin as the sun began to set, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic. The day had gone better than she'd feared, with several people extending genuine welcome. "What did Reverend Thomas say to you before we left?" she asked, curious about their private conversation. Matthew's cheeks colored slightly. "He suggested that while our arrangement might be above reproach in our eyes, others might view it differently. He offered to marry us if we wish to silence any gossip." Sarah nearly fell off her horse in surprise. "Marry? But we barely know each other." "That's what I told him," Matthew assured her. "Explained we're just business partners and friends." "And what did he say to that?" Sarah asked. Matthew's lips quirked in a half-smile. "He said for now, perhaps time will tell." The memory of those words hung between them as they continued homeward, neither quite ready to examine the implications too closely. The following weeks established a routine as they settled into life together. Days were filled with hard work repairing the cabin, tending the small garden Matthew had started, and planning for their future business. Sarah organized her inventory, taking stock of what they had and what they would need to open a proper store. Evenings were quieter, with shared meals and conversation by the fire. Matthew told stories of his travels throughout the territories, while Sarah shared memories of her childhood in Benton before Blackwell's shadow fell across her life. Gradually, they learned each other's histories, preferences, hopes, and fears. Matthew had grown up on a farm in Missouri, joined the Union Army as a young man, and wandered westward after the war, eventually buying this land with his savings. His marriage to Catherine had been happy but brief, ended by the fever that had claimed her and their unborn child. "After she died, I couldn't stay here," he admitted one evening as they sat by the fire. "Too many reminders, too much silence. So I started traveling, taking whatever work I could find, cattle drives, mining, even bounty hunting for a while." "What made you decide to come back?" Sarah asked. Matthew was quiet for a long moment. "Time, I suppose, and realizing that running doesn't really heal anything. The memories come with you." He looked at her across the fireplace. "What about you? Any suitors back in Benton?" Sarah shook her head. "A few showed interest, but most men wanted a wife who would stay home, not one who wanted to run a business. And after father fell ill, there wasn't time for courting anyway." As autumn deepened toward winter, they made several more trips to town. Each visit cemented Sarah's position in the community a little more firmly. She began helping at the church socials, offered to teach reading to several children whose parents had no schooling, and gradually won over even the most skeptical townspeople with her genuine warmth and industriousness. Old man Jenkins, true to his word, began serious discussions about selling his store. The price was fair, and with their combined resources, Sarah and Matthew could manage it, especially with the bank's willingness to extend credit based on Matthew's good standing and Sarah's inventory. "We could be open by spring," Sarah said excitedly one evening, reviewing their plans at the kitchen table. "Sooner if Jenkins agrees to a gradual transition." Matthew watched her animated face with a tender expression she didn't notice, too absorbed in her calculations. "You've brought this place back to life," he said softly. Sarah looked up, surprised. "The store." "Everything," Matthew clarified. "The cabin, the land, me." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I'm grateful you came into my life, Sarah Nelson." The touch of his hand sent warmth spreading through her. These moments had been happening more frequently, lingering glances, casual touches that didn't feel casual at all, conversations that deepened beyond mere friendship. Sarah wasn't naive. She recognized the growing attraction between them. What she didn't know was whether to encourage or resist it. "I'm the grateful one," she replied, gently withdrawing her hand on the pretext of gathering their papers. "You saved me from Blackwell, gave me a new start." Matthew accepted the subtle withdrawal, though something like disappointment flickered in his eyes. "Partners look out for each other," he said, rising from the table. "I should check on the horses before turning in." After he left, Sarah sat alone, contemplating the complex emotions swirling within her. She was attracted to Matthew. How could she not be? He was kind, honorable, handsome, and had shown her nothing but respect. Yet fear held her back, fear of dependency, of losing herself in another person's life, of being vulnerable in ways that went beyond business partnerships. The first snow came in early December, transforming the landscape into a glittering white expanse. Sarah woke to find Matthew already outside, clearing paths between the cabin, barn, and well. Through the window, she watched him work, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, his movements strong and efficient. When he came inside, bringing a blast of cold air with him, his cheeks were ruddy from exertion, snowflakes melting in his hair. Something about the sight made Sarah's heart ache with a sweet, unfamiliar longing. "Beautiful out there," he said, warming his hands by the fire she'd built. "Cold, but beautiful." Sarah handed him a cup of coffee. "The first snow always feels magical, doesn't it? Like the world is made new." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and neither pulled away immediately. For a breathless moment they stood close, the coffee cooling between them, something unspoken passing in their gaze. The moment was broken by a knock at the door. Matthew reluctantly stepped back, setting down the cup to answer it. Reverend Thomas stood on the porch, bundled against the cold. "Good morning. Thought I'd check on you folks after the snow." His keen eyes took in the domestic scene, Sarah by the fire, Matthew in his shirt sleeves, the intimate atmosphere. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Sarah said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Please come in, Reverend." Over coffee, the Reverend shared news from town and delivered a few letters that had arrived for Matthew. As their conversation continued, Sarah noticed him watching them with a knowing expression that made her self-conscious. When Matthew stepped outside to help the Reverend's driver with a balky horse, the older man turned to Sarah with gentle directness. "My dear," he said, "forgiveness is not my business, but I hope you'll permit an observation from someone who has counseled many couples over the years." Sarah tensed, uncertain what was coming. "Of course, Reverend. The way Matthew looks at you and you at him, when you think no one notices, speaks of feelings that go well beyond business partnership." He patted her hand kindly. "Life is too short and love too precious to waste time denying what's in your heart." Before Sarah could respond, Matthew returned, brushing snow from his coat. The Reverend soon took his leave, but his words lingered in Sarah's mind long after he'd gone. That evening they sat by the fire as usual, but a new awareness hummed between them, making ordinary conversation difficult. Finally, Matthew set aside the book he'd been pretending to read. "Sarah," he began, his voice serious, "I need to say something." Her heart quickened. "Yes." "These past months have been—" he searched for the right word, unexpected. "When I offered you partnership, I meant it only as business, a way to help you escape Blackwell. But now—" "Now," Sarah prompted when he hesitated. Matthew looked directly at her, his blue eyes intense in the firelight. "Now I find myself thinking of you as more than a partner or friend. Much more. And I need to know if you could ever feel the same way." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep inside Sarah. For a moment, she couldn't speak, too overwhelmed by the emotions his words unleashed. "I don't expect an answer tonight," Matthew continued when she remained silent. "I just needed you to know. Whatever you decide won't change our business arrangement. I promised you safety and independence, and that promise stands." Sarah found her voice at last. "Matthew, I do have feelings for you, but I'm afraid." "Of what?" he asked gently. "Of losing myself again," she admitted. "In Benton, I was defined by my father, then by Blackwell's threats. I've only just started to stand on my own. I don't want to become someone's wife before I've fully become myself." Understanding dawned in Matthew's eyes. "I would never ask you to be less than who you are, Sarah. What I feel for you has grown precisely because of your strength, your determination, your independence." He moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hand in his. "I'm not Blackwell. I don't want to possess you or control you. I want to stand beside you to build something together as equals." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes at the sincerity in his voice. "I need time, Matthew, to be sure. Can you understand that? All the time you need," he promised, pressing a gentle kiss to her hand before rising. "I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed were charged with new awareness. Small gestures took on greater significance, a hand helping her down from a wagon, fingers brushing while passing the salt at dinner, gazes meeting across a room. Neither pushed for more, yet both felt the subtle shift in their relationship, like ice beginning to thaw under spring sunshine. As Christmas approached, the town of Willow Creek buzzed with preparations. Sarah and Matthew were invited to numerous gatherings, their presence together now accepted without question. At each event, Sarah noticed how naturally Matthew fit into this community, and how warmly they had welcomed her by extension. Old man Jenkins finally agreed to sell his store, with the transition to begin after the new year. The news filled Sarah with excitement and a sense of accomplishment. Soon she would be a business owner again, this time on her own terms, free from Blackwell's threats. On Christmas Eve, they returned from the church service to find the cabin transformed. While Sarah had been busy with preparations for the church's celebration earlier in the day, Matthew had decorated their home with evergreen boughs, ribbons, and candles. A small tree stood in one corner, adorned with simple ornaments he must have carved himself. "Matthew," Sarah breathed, taking in the festive scene. "It's beautiful." "Christmas was Catherine's favorite holiday," he said softly. "Haven't celebrated properly since she died. Thought it was time to start again." He hesitated, then added, "with you." That night, as snow fell gently outside, they exchanged simple gifts by firelight. Sarah had knitted Matthew a scarf, the blue wool matching his eyes. He presented her with a small wooden box, similar to the one Martha Henderson had given her but more finely crafted, with intricate carvings of wildflowers on the lid. "You made this," Sarah said, tracing the delicate patterns with her fingertips. "Been working on it when you were in town," Matthew admitted. "Open it." Inside lay a silver locket on a fine chain. Sarah lifted it carefully, touched by the unexpected gift. "It was my mother's," Matthew explained. "One of the few things I have from her, I thought." "Well, I thought you might like it." Sarah opened the locket to find it empty. "Thank you," she whispered, genuinely moved. "It's beautiful." "The empty spaces are for your own memories," Matthew said, "past and future." Sarah looked up at him, something resolving in her heart. Without overthinking, she leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his lips there first. It was brief but held a promise that needed no words. When she pulled back, Matthew's expression was one of wonder and hope. "Merry Christmas, Sarah," he said softly. "Merry Christmas, Matthew," she replied, her heart fuller than it had been in years. The new year brought changes both expected and surprising. The purchase of Jenkins's store was finalized, and Sarah threw herself into preparations for reopening it under their management. Matthew divided his time between helping her and continuing improvements on the homestead, now with renewed purpose. Their relationship progressed cautiously, but steadily. Small kisses became longer ones, conversations deepened, and the boundaries between them softened. Sarah found that loving Matthew didn't diminish her independence as she'd feared. Instead, his support gave her confidence to pursue her ambitions more boldly. By February, renovations on the store were complete, and Nelson and Vance General Merchandise opened to enthusiastic support from the townspeople. Sarah's knack for anticipating customers' needs quickly made the store a success, while Matthew's connections with suppliers ensured they had goods that had previously been unavailable in Willow Creek. One evening in late March, as they walked home from the store, Matthew suggested a detour to the rise overlooking their property. "Look," he said when they reached the top, pointing to the valley below. In the fading light, Sarah could see their cabin, smoke rising from the chimney, the barn and corrals nearby. Spring was beginning to touch the landscape, with green shoots appearing in the fields and buds forming on the trees. "It's coming alive again," Matthew said, his voice tender. "Just like I have since you came into my life." Sarah turned to him, her heart full. "I was so afraid when we left Benton, afraid of Blackwell, afraid of starting over, afraid of depending on someone else." She took his hand. "But you never made me feel dependent. You made me feel stronger." Matthew drew her closer. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known, Sarah Nelson, and the one I love most in this world." "I love you too," she said, the words feeling right and true as they left her lips. Matthew's smile was radiant in the twilight. Then, to her surprise, he knelt before her. "I'm not asking you to be less than who you are," he said earnestly. I'm asking for the privilege of standing beside you for the rest of our lives, as equals, as partners in everything. Sarah Nelson, will you marry me?" Tears of joy filled Sarah's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Their wedding took place in May, with Reverend Thomas officiating and the entire town in attendance. Sarah wore a new dress of pale blue silk, and Matthew looked handsome in a suit he'd ordered specially from Denver. As they exchanged vows, Sarah felt none of the fear or doubt that had once plagued her, only certainty that this man, this partnership, was exactly right. The celebration afterward was joyous, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed twice their number. As the sun began to set, Matthew led his bride away from the festivities, back to their cabin, their home. "Mrs. Vance," he said as they crossed the threshold, his voice reverent. "Mr. Vance," Sarah replied with a smile. "Or should I say my partner in everything?" Matthew gathered her in his arms, his expression tender. "You're safe now," he whispered, echoing the words he'd said when they fled Benton. "We both are." In the years that followed, Sarah and Matthew built a life together that exceeded either's expectations. Their store thrived, expanding twice to meet the growing town's needs. They added rooms to the cabin, creating a comfortable home that welcomed visitors from near and far. 2 years after their wedding, their first child was born, a son they named James, after Sarah's father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 18 months later. Both children grew up understanding the value of hard work, honesty, and standing up for what's right, lessons their parents taught by example. Word reached them occasionally of Benton and Blackwell. The landlord's influence had waned after a federal investigation into corruption, sparked partly by evidence Matthew had gathered during their time there. Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that other women would not face the same threats she had. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Matthew presented Sarah with a deed, the final payment on a new building in town that would house an expanded version of their store, with living quarters above for a young couple just starting out. "For the future," he explained. "So our children can choose their own paths, knowing there's always a place for them here." Sarah looked at her husband, the man who had saved her in more ways than one, and marveled at how life's hardest challenges sometimes led to its greatest blessings. "Who would have thought," she said, linking her fingers with his, "that running from Blackwell would lead me straight to happiness?" Matthew's smile was as warm as the day she'd first seen it in her father's store. "Not running from," he corrected gently. "Running toward." "You've always been brave enough to move toward better things, Sarah. I'm just grateful to be one of them." As twilight descended over their valley, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a desperate escape to a life rich with purpose and love, from fear to security, from solitude to family, all because a cowboy had walked into her store one day and decided to stand up for what was right. "You're still my hero," she whispered, leaning into his embrace. "Every day." Matthew kissed her tenderly, his arms strong and protective around her. "And you're still the bravest woman I know," he replied. "Every day." Together they watched the sunset give way to stars, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them as they had faced everything since leaving Benton, side by side, partners in all things. Their love a shelter stronger than any storm.